Hello, this is Digital Accessibility, the people behind the progress. I'm Joe Walensky, the creator and host of this series. And as an accessibility professional myself, I find it very interesting as to how others have found their way into this profession. So let's meet one of those people right now and hear about their journey. All right, well, here we go with another visit with an accessibility practitioner. And today I am pleased to be talking to Andrew Hayward. Hello, Andrew. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you, Joe?
Yeah, I'm really good. I'm talking from home office in the Seattle area on Vashon Island. Where are you talking to us from?
I am joining you from an armchair in my living room in southeast London in the UK. It's a little bit later for me than it is for you, but appreciate you taking the time to talk to
Well,
me.
I appreciate you sharing in this as well. And so, we'll talk about, a lot of things about, what you're involved with accessibility. But I mean, just to start out, what's your current situation? What type of work are you doing?
So currently, I am an accessibility engineer at Twitter, company you may have heard of. Twitter is on the early beginnings of its sort of disability and accessibility journey. We have founded a product accessibility team about a year ago now, in which, I was sort of part of getting that set up. And yeah, it's just been a really sort of big year for us getting that going. And yeah, the team has just sort of grown from one person a year ago to now best part of 10 people at this point. So yeah.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear about the growth in that. And this podcast is all about hearing about people's journeys that led them into accessibility work. So, why don't you just pick a spot? Go back in time, maybe pick out some of the, maybe one of the first milestones that started you on the road that got you to where you are today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think we talk a lot about accessibility practitioners, and yet from a professional perspective, that's sort of very few and far between. Technically, in my 15-ish year career at this point, I have been a professional accessibility engineer for one of those. The others I've just been in web development, software engineering, and it's almost just sort of been there as an underlying constant. When I first started getting into web development, the web standards movement was a really big thing, certainly in the world I was part of. Accessibility was just something that you did. It wasn't, sort of a specialty. It wasn't, a profession that people really went into. It was just part of doing the right thing. You have a good design, you have good UX, and you have good accessibility. And that was just how I sort of grew up building for the web, and that's kind of stuck with me ever since. Yes, I mean it's something I've tried to do all along. It wasn't until I started working for Mozilla quite some time ago now, where I really started thinking about sort of the intersection of humanity in the internet. Sort of all the things I've been doing before that, they were, mostly web based. There's a bit of desktop software along the way, but mostly web based stuff.
Well,
Yeah, it wasn't really until I got to Mozilla that it was like actually thinking about the people using these things. So
let's just stop there and dig into that a little bit. So you mentioned you had the web development background and that you'd
mm.
been aware of that. So did it just start out with learning things online, or just hearing from others about the accessibility aspect of your development?
Yes, I mean, I suppose this was kind of turn of the century, really. Coming into the, the 21st century, um, and yeah, it was just sort of it was a really small core community of of web interested people. I don't say web developers because it was a good mixture of people, still is really. But it was just a sort of a group of people who you could kind of know a lot of them, and it was just a lot of conversational stuff. And people wrote blog posts, as people used to do. And it's all microblogging these days, and and things like that. But yeah, people wrote full-on articles on their websites about different things they'd been doing, just sort of exploring how things worked. Obviously, the web of 20 years ago was a very different landscape to what it is today, both in terms of what we've got available to us as developers, but also the people using it. Sort of the people on the internet 20 years ago, in many respects, had the same problem, but it just wasn't as widely used, I suppose. It was very early days for sort of really thinking about what it meant to build an accessible experience. Obviously, Tim Berners-Lee and his whole, the web is for everyone. It should be accessible, and I think to begin with, it kind of felt like that's just how it was. And I don't want to sort of be the old man shaking his fist at the clouds, but it feels like we, as a community, sort of missed a turn somewhere along the way, and we pursued developer happiness over user happiness, which is, it's a little upsetting because we built all these tools that allow us to notionally build these great experiences, and yet we forget what it means to build a properly inclusive and accessible web.
Well, you have been involved in it essentially from the start of the formalized integration of accessibility, because the World Wide Web Consortium had its initial web accessibility initiative start around 1998, and that was my first exposure to it. And so then, as then you mentioned a little later on, it was at Mozilla where you really got more involved. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so at Mozilla, I was working on a few different projects. I sort of came on board just as a general web developer, sort of working on a few sort of just profile portfolio type sites that Mozilla was working on. But then over time, sort of went into specific projects. And it was really sort of Mozilla's aim is to sort of think about how people use the internet, and how we can use the internet for the good of that audience. And so, as I said, while I was trying to build accessible experiences to the best of my, ability at the time, I wasn't really thinking about people. I was just sort of thinking about accessibility, and that's sort of like, it sounds a bit a bit of a silly split, but so the academic side of accessibility it's all well and good, but until you start actually applying it to people, it doesn't really mean very much. You can read the specs all day, but until you get it in front of people and actually say, like, does this work for you, then you're never really going to know. So sort of working at Mozilla and thinking like, even though the work I was doing wasn't accessibility related, it made me just think much more about the people that we were building for and not the things we were building. And I think that was sort of like a turning point, really, of just sort of moving from sort of thinking about it technically to thinking about it from a human point of view. So.
Yeah. Well, I think it sounds like it was a very progressive, user-centered design approach overall, and so that benefits everyone who participates with the project. And although it sounds like you were involved in the technical aspects of it initially, ultimately, we rely on that to be, for assistive devices to be able to work effectively. So that part of it is definitely good that you were, investing the time there. In the work that you did at Mozilla, did it move itself into like any official projects where accessibility was specifically addressed in your time there?
Not specifically, no. I mean, I worked with some great teams who were really sort of forward thinking about this kind of stuff. Our designers and our product managers and our researchers, they're all sort of on board with saying, yeah, okay, this is all of our responsibility. If we want to build products that are fully inclusive, then we have to think about these things all the way through that whole process. So No, I mean there was no specific sort of accessibility related things. I mean, as I said at the beginning, it's only really in the last year that it's been my official job title in 15 plus years of doing this professionally. So yeah, it's interesting that to me, I don't think it needs to be a job title for it to be something that you think about. I think it's good to have professionals thinking about it all the time that we can go to that can be sort of subject matter experts, I suppose is the phrase that's going around these days. But ultimately, you don't have to be an expert. You don't even have to be like educated in it. I think you just have to. The baseline is you have to have an awareness that there are people who have different access needs, and you need to be able to push that conversation at every step of the development process, and just challenging people to think about that. That's where the experts come in to be able to answer those questions. But ultimately, if you have people on development teams who are just saying, "Hey, what about this scenario?" You might not be able to come up with a solution, but having a team just stop and think about it it's a huge step. And unfortunately, most teams don't take that step, right? Today. So
let's dig into your experience with that. Working with it in that situation. Did you build your own library of code solutions and things like that? How did you kind of manage accessibility in that time period?
So I mean, I suppose this was all at a time when things like jQuery were just coming about, and stuff like that. So a lot of the web still is to a degree built on the back of frameworks like that. Fortunately, a lot of the more modern web frameworks, at least, do take into consideration accessibility to a degree. So I suppose all along, it's really, I've always found it a bit easier, certainly when working on sort of bespoke portfolio type sites, to just build them in their own way, in a way that works for that experience. I think sometimes it's easy to forget that just because the library you're using might offer accessible components, you can't just shove a bunch of components in a box and hope that the contents of that box are accessible too. Accessibility doesn't work like that. So I've always just sort of taken each project on its own. Sometimes, particularly as I've sort of got further along and worked at larger places and they've had sort of design systems in place, working to make sure that design system is accessible is obviously a key part of that. But ultimately, you just have to be able to think about the whole experience too. And for a smaller portfolio project, the sorts of things I was working on 10 something years ago, for me at least, it was easier just to approach it from like a baseline anyway, and just say, okay, what does this project need? And most of the time, it doesn't need a big framework. There are some things that sort of used regularly, grid layouts and things like that, which are fortunately much easier to do today than they were 10 years ago. But for the most part, it's just sort of, it's knowing the concepts rather than having repeatable, reusable code. And just sort of knowing what sorts of traps are going to be in place, the things to look out for. And so it's as much experience as anything else, unfortunately. I mean, I'd like to be able to say that we could just give a fresh developer, here's a framework, it'll do everything for you, but it's never going to work like that, because the experience of an individual user, it doesn't come down to frameworks and doesn't come down to design systems. It is a matter of how do we make sure that this whole experience workflow works for as many people as possible. Because I mean, you can't say this is an accessible experience because different users have different access needs, and the chances of covering all of them are slim anyway, let alone trying to do it with a one-size-fits-all framework.
So as you moved on from Mozilla, what were some of the next kind of highlights that you had as which got you to where you're at today in your current organization?
So after Mozilla, I moved to Etsy, the online retail. Um, and that was a bit of an eye opener because I just sort of naturally assumed that in the corporate world, um, these things were thought about, because of the legal precedent, if nothing else. It's one thing working for a small startup or a sort of a more user focused environment like Mozilla. But I just assumed that like a larger corporate entity like Etsy would have just sort of had it done and sorted. Um, so when I went there, and that was as I said, a bit of an eye opener because I started looking at the Etsy code base and I started looking at the website, and it was a bit of a mess, certainly from a screen reader perspective. Nobody was really thinking about it, and I did a sort of a lunch and learn type talk, I guess not long after I started, and all it really took was to play a recording of a screen reader trying to read out the Etsy homepage for people to just sort of sit up and be silent and just be like, what is this? How, first of all, because they'd never really experienced a screen reader reading a website. But secondly, it's like, this makes absolutely no sense. And out of that, Etsy did start an accessibility team, which was good to see. That wasn't what I did. I carried on working on the projects I was doing. But it was more just recognizing that everyone has the ability to make some change, if they are willing to just sort of step up and say something. You don't have to be some high level executive in a company to get people to notice. So it's not really something I've ever really thought about until more recently. That advocacy doesn't mean sort of standing on a box and shouting. It just means seeing a problem and talking about it. You can do that quietly, you can do that loudly, you can do it in whatever way suits you. But just sort of making people aware of a problem in a way that works and makes sense to them is a really powerful sort of step to take. And I've been asked a few times in the last few years, it's like, oh, how do you do all of this stuff? And it's like, oh, I don't like it. It really is just a matter of like, well, it's important to me, and I feel like it should be important to you too, so I'm going to talk to you about it. And it's as simple as that, really. So that was, yeah, to answer your question, moving on to Etsy was that sort of like, yeah, not even in sort of corporate America is this really a thing that's thought about. And I suppose that was just sort of a little bit of naivety there, probably, just sort of expecting that even though it might not be great, there would still be this understanding that it was a thing that was needed.
I think your experience there isn't unusual. I mean, we both mentioned how long we've been thinking about this, and looking back on 20 years, I thought a lot more would have happened in the last 20 years. On the other hand, I'm excited by the things that have happened and and where it has been embraced. And so I think your example there at Etsy just shows how your own passion and interest at a grassroots level can move things forward.
Mm.
And so what was the next step after that?
Next step after that,
or wherever you want to take it to, if you want to bring it up to where you are today.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, happy to jump forward to Twitter. So yeah, I started at Twitter about 3 years ago, and I think just sort of having had the experiences at Mozilla and Etsy, of just recognizing that there's nothing wrong with talking about stuff, and just sort of being yourself and expressing what's important to you. Just carried on doing that. It just sort of became part of being a more senior engineer, was just telling the team almost, it's like, okay, this is good, but we haven't thought about this. It's always frustrating when you see accessibility sort of get written up as work tickets and put in a separate box. It's like, well, no, like the thing you're working on isn't finished until it's also accessible. Um, I can understand that, we do things and sometimes we miss things out and we have to file a bug or whatever and it gets fixed. But trying to encourage this idea that a thing that you're working on also has to consider accessibility. You can't just say, oh, well, I'll get back to that, because people don't, like, whatever it is. Often, people, it's like, you might add a to-do item, but very rarely do we really get around to doing a lot of these things. And accessibility in particular, I think, because people view it as this sort of alien challenge almost. It's like, well, I don't know anything about that, so I'm just going to put it over there and maybe think about it later. And as I said, you don't have to have the solution to it. You just have to be able to think about it. And it can be hard. And certainly at bigger places where there's no sort of conversation happening. But ultimately, just most importantly, being aware that there are these problems, I think. And that's what I've tried to encourage at Twitter, is just to sort of think about the fact that these problems exist, and just to have an awareness. And so, 2.5 years ago now, we started a sort of just an individual champions network, I suppose. It was very informal. I say a group of like-minded employees all came together and just said, like, yeah, we need to sort of push this conversation out a bit. It's all well and good having 2 or 3 people here and there just having these conversations, but we need to be able to work out how to push that conversation out from outside this small group. And so, we set up this informal accessibility champions network, and we just sort of, we got some recognition for it. Yes, which was good. I think, that in many ways that's much more important than having a formal team. If you have sufficient numbers of people with that awareness and having that conversation, then the formal team can follow from there. They can then become the people who you might go to with questions. But if you rely on a formal team and don't have that network, then first of all, they get massively overwhelmed. Like there's no way that they can do all the work that needs to be done. But secondly, they will always be playing catch up. There will always be things going out that they are then having to go back and fix. Accessibility needs to be thought about from the beginning. It needs to be part of that whole process. And so if you've got people who are willing to just have that conversation, then ideally, the designs that come through, the product ideas that come through, the engineering output, it's got accessibility baked in. And so that sort of core team, their responsibility really only has to be answering questions and doesn't have to be about fixing problems or coming in and helping a team out. That's sort of where we are today. We've got that balance of sort of the champions network, which we've managed to formalize now. That's a properly recognized sort of group that people are given dedicated time for, and we also have the core team that is working on some of our own sort of product features where we see that things are missing, but also mostly just sort of being a sort of a pool for answering questions, helping people out, because these questions are coming through, and that's what we want to see. We want to see all these questions that people have, and we can sort of share them. And a lot of, actually, we're at a point now where we're able to, the first point of call for these questions is to go to the champions network. People don't even come to us, they just ask each other. And it's only really when it's a problem that people haven't seen before that they have to come to us. So it's hugely beneficial for us, because people aren't just relying on us to fix all the problems. I mean, this isn't to say we don't have a long way to go. We're very much in the early days, sort of baby steps at this point. But things have massively improved in the last year and a half, which is just that really is just the effect of a group of people coming together and saying we want to see some change, and we're going to just keep talking until that change happens. So.
So it sounds like you mentioned the champions, but it sounds like there's kind of two levels. You have support going across the organization from you and your accessibility colleagues, but then are people then also assigned to individual projects within the organization that they pay attention to?
Yeah, sometimes, definitely some of our higher profile projects, we will sort of dedicate a lot of our time to. Um, if they need some help getting things out the door, then it just makes sense to put one of the accessibility team on that project just to help guide them through and make sure those conversations are happening rather than having to sort of wait for things to filter through to us. Because obviously higher profile features on a site like Twitter, they can quite quickly, if we put them out in an inaccessible way, then the publicity around that isn't great. So even just from a team perspective, we want to see these high profile features going out being accessible from day one. So that's our motivation. But yeah, it's a mixture. Some of it is just working on new features to existing things that we think are missing. Because unfortunately, when product conversations happen without the accessibility being taken into account, people and teams miss certain aspects. And that's not to point fingers at people. It's just a lack of awareness and a lack of that conversation, which is why it's so important. So some of it we're just having to go back and fill in gaps that ideally wouldn't have been there in the first place. But it's the old. It's easier to put out an accessible thing than it is to go back and put accessibility into it. And we are now having to spend quite a lot of time just re-engineering bits and pieces that were never considered with some part of accessibility in mind.
Yeah.
But it's fruitful work. Like it's frustrating, but it's good to be able to have that time and dedicated space to be able to say, okay, what is missing from this product feature and how can we fix it?
Yeah, well, that's all part of the process. You don't always, know what you don't know. And then as you identify things related to accessibility, you can build it into the business processes earlier on so that it comes through research, design to a specification and makes it easier to so that you don't have a lot of remediation at the end.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me and talk about your experiences. And good luck with what appears to be a growing attention to accessibility at your company. And maybe we'll meet up at some point in the physical world.
Yeah, that'd be great. No, yeah, teams coming along. We're getting there. As I said, we've been around for about a year now. It really kicked off at the beginning of 21. 2022, hopefully lots of time and space to really just sort of push forward and kick on with that growth. So yeah, it's going well.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks, Joe.